out of your chairs. I want you to get up right now and go to the window, open it, and stick your head out and yell, "I'm as bad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore."
Now, here are your two Mad Radio Network hosts, Mark Weiss and Doug Gladstone.
Hey, good evening, everybody. And that's our first intro, the first time I've heard that. A supreme job done by our producer, Eric Salver.
It really was. Eric has earned all the money we are paying him.
Yeah, I'm telling you, scratch him away from his friends Laura, Mary, Fonzie, and Richie. I mean, good job. Job well done. Good evening, everybody. How are you? I'm Mark Weiss, Doug Glanville, and tonight we have ourselves a special guest, somebody who's big in the broadcasting business, unlike us who are just trying to think we are, but somebody who's really a top-notch broadcaster, former Major League Baseball player. I guess can we say social justice activist as well, or would that be pushing it too far, Mr. Doug Gladstone? Welcome to the show.
No, this is a social justice activist as well, and if I could, if you could kindly indulge me here, he is the pride of Teaneck, New Jersey. For 8 years, he roamed the outfield for the Philadelphia Phillies, the Texas Rangers, and the Chicago Cubs. If there is one word that attaches itself like flypaper to this gentleman, it would probably be cerebral. Cerebral. Not the cerebral assassin, not WWE's Triple H, but cerebral. And if you've had the opportunity to look at our Facebook site, you've seen a lot of his truly magnificent, and I don't use that word loosely, magnificent thought-provoking pieces when he was a columnist for the New York Times. He contributed to the Opinionator section. A couple of years back, he wrote a absolutely earth-shattering first-hand account of what happened to him when he was profiled in his own driveway. And that was in the great magazine, The Atlantic. That led to legislation being passed, it's my understanding, by the General Assembly in Connecticut. This man, as my colleague Mark has already said, is just filled with talent. It was truly a ridiculous firing when he, along with other people, were let go by ESPN because he was the best thing about Baseball Tonight as one of the lead analysts. I will tell you that our relationship started out in a rocky way. He can chime in and tell you about that if he chooses to. But I am privileged and just proud that he gave me a second chance. We can learn a lot through the game of baseball. One of the things he said in his brilliant book, The Game from Where I Stand, is that baseball facilitates and fosters communication. And over the years, ever since that rocky beginning, I've come to admire this man. And if it sounds like I've got a bromance going with him, you'll have to forgive me, because he is just a person who I admire greatly. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, it gives Mark and I great pleasure to introduce to you now the one, the only. And I should mention he is also an adjunct lecturer at his alma mater of Penn, Doug Glanville. Dougie, DG.
Well, thank you so much, Doug, and you guys really humbled by the introduction. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure, and And Doug, look, the feeling is mutual. I know you talked about the rocky start, but what I later always talked about, the rocky start was only that you were calling, as you're doing now, calling people to the mat who are in a position to change the circumstances of players who really pioneered the baseball economic system that we know today. And they paid a great price for it. And unfortunately, in many regards, they are still paying. And you wrote about it, and you called me out by name because of like you said, I've done all this work. I'm now on the Major League Baseball Players Alumni Association board, and have written about the topic. And you're just like, hey, what can you do? You could do more, And really, it didn't take long to step back and say that's true. I want to do more. I want to, nothing greater to testimony to the respect for the game when you honor those that came before you. So I love what you're doing in calling out everybody under the sun to basically do their part in recognizing their history, and not just recognizing it, but taking it to the level of really taking care of your history. So we aligned very much there, and it didn't take long to understand that, we were on the same page and the same side on that issue. And I like and really appreciate your work on many of the things that you've shed light on sort of the underdog, the story that needs to be told. So I feel very fortunate I'm able to be a voice in the sport that I love, but also use it as a platform to be able to address a lot more complicated, challenging social issues. And thanks for having me on.
Mark, I know you want to jump in, but I just got to tell our listeners that shortly before Game 2 of the 2017 World Series began, this personifies for me everything that, Doug Glanville is all about. I get a text during the pregame because the Dodgers had trotted out the only Purple Heart winner who had ever played Major League Baseball, Roy Gleason. And I recognized the text, the cell phone, as being Doug's. And he said, dude, this guy, does he have the 43 game days? And I quickly looked up on Baseball Almanac or Baseball Reference, and I said, no, he only had 25. And I'm going to let Doug tell you, because, so much of our efforts, both Mark and mine, have been concentrated to giving a square deal, a fair deal for the men who had more than 43 game days of credit, but less than 4 years. Doug Glanville's taking it a step farther, and I want people to understand that Doug Glanville, is not just some Johnny-come-lately. He wants to actually help not only the men who are being hosed out of pensions, and there are currently only 641 of those, but there are 210 unfortunate souls who didn't even attain the 43 game days worth of credit, who Doug Glanville wants to help.
Yeah, Doug, it's I go back to the appreciation of just being able to, the lens where it needs to be in regards to this history. And look, I've seen baseball from many perspectives, as a player, and as an analyst, but I also was involved in the Players Association, working closely with Don Fear on the executive subcommittee. Sat down with interviews with Rob Manfred, and negotiations with MLB and all these things that, as part of. So getting those perspectives crystallized it even more that it's going to require a collective effort. There's people who have power to do more, but the real power of the story that goes behind it needs to come from all these agencies that we talked about that have served players and fans and the game alike. And so you recognize that, I read many of your articles you've talked about, the pre-1980, the moment in 1980 where the transition occurred, where this defined benefits, the pension plan came into effect, the benefits around, health care, all these things started to evolve. That was a moment where the negotiations did not work retroactively, and so these players in this pre-1980 class that didn't meet certain milestones did not become beneficiaries of this. And it, I believe it was April 2011. There was an attempt to sort of right the ship, and there was some progress made that we have to somewhat, recognize as there was efforts to say, okay, let's try to address this, but it still was not in the caliber, especially when you look at today's game and the billions of dollars passed around, of what someone even like myself as a player who would be able to look forward and see coming, pensions and things like that. So, I know, and I think a lot of people do know, at least subconsciously, if not factually, that the system that was created is on the backs of those who came before us. And that is something that's actually a core principle of the Players Association and how they've educated players to stay strong in fights, many fights with the owners about, whether it is free agency and all the strikes and lockouts and labor stoppages that have come about, has been this sense of camaraderie and linkage between this thread of time, right? And somewhere in there, we're missing the sort of, maybe it's a blind spot to the originators, right? The original class that made all this possible, that started the system, many cases missed time that would have been counted because they were fighting for this system, right? I mean, that's what's the most egregious to me. Is like there was players that played, and the reason they don't have 43 days and all these things is because, maybe they were on strike or lockouts or they missed service time. So there's a lot that can be done, and I can't imagine that when you put MLB, the Players Association, the Alumni Association, fans, and telling the stories to get in a room and say this is our priority, that we cannot figure out a way to get it done.
Yeah, Doug, I hear what you're saying and what you're doing, and the same thing for Mr. Glanville as well, Mr. Glanville, and Mr. Gladstone, what you guys are doing. But what I think about is you, Mr. Glanville, have so much to lose by sticking your neck out and standing up for these guys, because there are so many other people in positions of power and also who are connected to the game itself, and they won't say anything or do anything. They get emails. I'm sure you see them too, because Mr. Gladstone sends them out all the time and updates us on what's going on, and it's like crickets chirping. They ignore them, and it's quite frustrating. And I have to really say that what you're doing, standing up for these guys, is amazing, because let's face it, you have a career. You're a broadcaster, and you can lose access because of standing up for this thing. So, I want to thank you on behalf of them, and I'm not even an activist. I'm just a co-host over here. Mr. Gladstone is the one who made me see the light on what's going on with these guys, and I've probably gotten so involved I started taking it to a new level, but thank you.
Yeah, well, I think the thing to keep in mind is, and this is what I've learned and been able to pass on in teaching when I taught my class. It was called Communication, Sports, and Social Justice. I taught it at my alma mater, University of Pennsylvania, and really a great experience. And what I learned, and what was sort of one of the emphasis points of the class, was that social justice, one of the fundamental elements you need is communication, right? It's your ability to convey messages. And there's so many different styles that are needed. Whenever change happens, whether you go back to Martin Luther King, or there's many different fronts that need to be told. Doug Gladstone has, gotten the bullhorn and gone out there and challenged people. That's necessary. You need protests. You need the slow burn, like when I worked on the legislation. You mentioned on the snow shoveling incident in Connecticut. I worked the slow burn. It took 18 months to kind of chip away and talk to legislators and work on a law. And all those are necessary. And I think when you hit all the fronts, you can make a lot of progress. But that last piece, and so this is where I think the fans can play a great role, is the telling the stories. Tell the stories. I guarantee every one of these players, I don't care if they played 5 days, have some amazing story to tell, whether in their life or some engagement through the fans.